The first light of December 1st, 1948 crept slowly across Somerton Beach, painting the sand in pale gold and brushing the cold seawall with a soft morning glow. The fishermen out early barely noticed the man sitting upright against the stones. In a coastal town like this, it wasn't unusual to find someone sleeping off a rough night, especially near the shoreline where the breeze could cool the lingering heat of a late November evening. But something about the figure was strange, even from a distance. He sat too straight, too still, his legs stretched out neatly in front of him as if arranged by careful hands. A passing rider on horseback was the first to realize something wasn't right. He circled back, studying the man more closely. The stranger's shoes were polished, his suit pressed, and there was no sign of sand on his clothing, as though he hadn't staggered through the beach at all. When the rider called out and received no answer, he felt a quiet dread settle in. By the time police arrived, the sun was higher, and the stillness of the man had taken on a far more chilling meaning. Officers approached cautiously. The figure appeared to be in his mid-40s, perhaps older, his face calm, too calm. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, and no bruising. His arms rested loosely at his sides, fingers curled slightly inward, as though he had drifted into a peaceful sleep. But the peacefulness was deceptive. The closer they looked, the more details stood out. The absence of a hat, unusual in 1948, the position of the body, oddly poised, and the fact that no one recognized him, despite the beach being in a well-traveled part of Adelaide. When they searched his pockets, the mystery deepened immeasurably. No wallet, no identification, no bus ticket stubs leading to his home, nothing that tied him to a name or place. The labels on his clothing, every single one, had been meticulously cut out. Even the brand labels on his tie and jacket had been removed with the kind of precision that suggested intention, not happenstance. Who cuts tags out of their clothes? And more importantly, why? Among the items found were mundane objects that only heightened the strangeness. A comb, chewing gum, a packet of Army Club cigarettes, but with a different, cheaper brand of cigarettes inside. A half-used box of matches. These things were ordinary on their own, but collectively they felt curated, as though selected to appear unremarkable while hiding something far from normal. And then, deep within a small fob pocket sewn on the inside of his trousers, so small that officers almost missed it entirely, they found a tightly folded scrap of paper. When opened, it revealed two printed words in Persian. Taman Shud. It is finished. A phrase torn from the final page of a rare book, a phrase that sounded ominous in any language. Investigators stared at it, puzzled. Why would a dead man carry such a thing? Was it a message? A clue? A declaration? As the morning wore on, more details made the scene feel oddly staged. Witnesses from the previous night recalled seeing the man lying on the sand in the same position hours earlier, around 7 p.m., but assumed he was alive. One couple even noticed him raise his arm slightly, only to let it fall back down, as if he were drunk and half asleep. If he had been dying then, he showed no signs of distress, no convulsions, no cries for help, nothing. The beach became a hive of activity as police cordoned off the area, photographers captured every angle, and curious onlookers gathered to watch. The man's face, illuminated fully now by the rising sun, bore no trace of pain. Some officers remarked that he looked almost dignified, like someone who had prepared himself for the end. Others felt uneasy, sensing that they had stumbled upon something far more complicated than a simple, unexplained death. By midday, word had spread that an unidentified man had been found on Somerton Beach. Reporters circled like birds over fresh water, sensing a story. But even they couldn't have predicted that the quiet, motionless figure against the seawall would become the center of one of Australia's most enduring unsolved mysteries. The scrap of paper found on him, cryptic, poetic, final, would outlive almost every person who worked on the case. And the man himself, though unknown, would be remembered for decades simply as the Somerton Man. A stranger who arrived in silence, died without witnesses, and left behind a riddle that remains unsolved to this day. To understand why the death of a single unidentified man caused such a stir, you have to imagine Australia in 1948, a nation caught between the aftershocks of one global war and the rising tension of another that hadn't yet been officially named. The Second World War had ended only 3 years earlier, leaving behind a country both rebuilding and repositioning itself in a rapidly shifting world. Adelaide, seemingly quiet and distant from global drama, was actually sitting in the middle of a geopolitical crossroads, and beneath its calm surface, nerves were frayed, tempers tight, and suspicion was becoming a natural instinct. The Cold War had effectively begun, even if newspapers hadn't started calling it that. Soviet intelligence agencies, now emboldened and expanding their networks, saw Australia as fertile ground, not for ideological reasons, but for strategic ones. The British Commonwealth was still a major global player, and Australia's cooperation with Britain and the United States made it an attractive target for espionage. Intelligence leaks, intercepted communications, and whispers in diplomatic channels suggested that foreign agents were already operating quietly in several major cities. And Adelaide, despite its reputation as a quieter town, held more value than most outsiders realized. Just north of the city lay the Woomera Test Range, one of the most secretive military projects in the Commonwealth. It was here that Britain and Australia collaborated on missile research, weapons testing, and early rocket development. Information flowing in and out of the site was considered top-tier intelligence, valuable enough that foreign governments were eager to get their hands on anything they could. And that meant espionage activity in South Australia wasn't just possible, it was expected. Everyday citizens may not have understood the full extent of the tension, but they felt it in the air. The sudden increase in military personnel moving through the region, the classified shipments transported under heavy guard, rumors, some exaggerated, some frighteningly accurate, about Soviet operatives posing as migrants or laborers. Even the newspapers, cautious not to reveal too much, published occasional pieces about international plots, intercepted agents, or suspicious disappearances. Into this atmosphere walked a man with no name, dressed too neatly, carrying items too intentionally curated, and leaving behind a trail that looked less like an accident and more like an encrypted message. Police officers who first handled the Somerton Beach case had lived through wartime intelligence scares. They knew how easily spies could slip in and out of civilian life. Many had worked alongside military personnel during the war, assisting with counter-espionage or monitoring suspicious visitors. So when they examined a man with all labels removed from his clothing, with a suitcase later found to contain modified tools, and with a mysterious scrap of foreign text, the jumps to espionage weren't leaps, they were logical steps. Investigators began to ask themselves quiet, uncomfortable questions. Was he a foreign operative? Was he poisoned? Did someone stage his death to send a message? Or was Adelaide hosting a much larger game than anyone had been told? The public only learned fragments of this growing concern. Newspapers mentioned the death, the beach, the strange condition of his clothes. But the deeper layers, military tension, intelligence alerts, the possibility that this unidentified man wasn't just a victim, but a participant in covert operations, were kept mostly behind closed doors. Even within the police force, information was compartmentalized. Some officers were told to treat the case as a routine death. Others were instructed to monitor potential connections between the unknown man and overseas agents. But as the days unfolded, it became clear to everyone involved that this wasn't a simple case. Adelaide was a city at the intersection of global conflict and local vulnerability, a place where ordinary life brushed dangerously close to the shadow world of espionage. And the Somerton man, whoever he was, had walked straight into that invisible battlefield. Whether he came willingly or was dragged into it remains one of the most troubling questions of the entire mystery. What made the era even more volatile was the influx of new migrants entering Australia after the war. Ships arrived packed with displaced families, labourers, refugees, and in some cases, individuals whose pasts were murky or impossible to trace.
So when the Somerton man appeared with no identification, no past, and no explanation, authorities didn't just see a dead man. They saw the possibility of a link in an invisible chain, one forged between global intelligence powers, Cold War paranoia, and a coastal city that was trying to piece itself back together after years of wartime strain. and as the clues continued to unfold, that possibility would only grow stronger. When investigators took a closer look at the man on Somerton Beach, what struck them first wasn't anything dramatic or gruesome. It was the neatness, the strange, almost unsettling level of care in how he was dressed. His brown trousers were sharply pressed, his button-up shirt clean and crisp, and the double-breasted jacket looked as though it had been chosen deliberately, not thrown on in haste. Even the tie was knotted with practiced precision. In the chaos of post-war Australia, where travel was long, clothing was repaired and reused, and men often looked worn from work, this stranger looked impossibly well kept. Yet the longer the authorities studied him, the more odd this immaculate appearance became. In 1948, no man went outside without a hat. It was a social standard so ingrained that being bareheaded in public felt almost improper. But this man wore none. Not tucked beside him, not behind the seawall, not washed ashore nearby. It was as if he had stepped onto the sand in perfect attire, except for the one item every man owned. More bizarre still were his shoes. The leather was polished to a mirror shine, the soles nearly spotless, despite him being found on a beach where sand should have lodged deep into the creases. Officers noted quietly among themselves that the shoes suggested he had not walked across the sand at all, at least not recently. It was a detail that added an uncomfortable layer. If he hadn't arrived under his own power, how had he gotten there? Then came the discovery that transformed a curious case into a confounding one. Every label on his clothing had been meticulously removed. Not just scratched out or faded, cut out entirely. The stitches and seams bore the unmistakable signs of scissors or a sharp knife. In that era, clothing labels mattered. They showed the tailor, the origin, sometimes even a name. Removing them was not common practice unless someone wanted to erase any hint of identity. To the police, this was no coincidence. It was intentional, deliberate, and deeply suspicious. As they searched his pockets, the strangeness grew. He carried a pack of Army Club cigarettes, but inside were 7 cigarettes of an entirely different brand, Kenseaters, more expensive and far less common. This might seem small, but not to investigators. In the 1940s, counterfeit cigarette packs were often used in black market trades and covert exchanges. It raised the question, was this man accustomed to switching items, disguising appearances, or preparing decoys? His comb was American-made, which wasn't impossible, but was unusual for an unknown man with no travel records and no signs of being a foreign visitor. He carried a used bus ticket, but the origin didn't match the train ticket found on him. One was used, the other wasn't. Why? Had his plans changed suddenly? Had someone else changed them for him? Even the way the items were arranged felt staged. Each object was too mundane alone, but too oddly curated together. Gum, a box of matches, cigarettes in the wrong packet, a comb from another country, a half roll of juicy fruit. None of it answered anything. All of it added questions. Forensic examiners turned his pockets inside out, hoping for a torn receipt, a loose coin, anything to attach him to a place or identity. Instead, they found the most enigmatic clue of the entire early investigation. A tiny, almost invisible pocket sewn into the waistband of his trousers, something many modern viewers don't know existed. Inside that hidden pocket, no larger than a thumbprint, was where they later discovered the Taman Shud scrap. A pocket such as that was rarely used, reserved traditionally for watch chains or valuables. To hide a message inside it suggested intention. Investigators began to argue quietly among themselves. Was this a simple vagrant who dressed suspiciously well? Unlikely. Was he a man fleeing from someone? If so, why dress so neatly? Or was this something else entirely? A man trying very hard to disappear, or perhaps a man already caught in something he couldn't escape. When the body was finally moved from the beach, officers stood by watching as the still figure was lifted onto a stretcher, the pressed suit catching the morning light one last time. The mystery surrounding him already felt heavy, as though the beach itself had absorbed a secret too large to explain. Everything about him, his clothes, the missing labels, the spotless shoes, the misplaced cigarettes, hinted that the story behind his death was far stranger than the peaceful scene suggested. And as the investigation continued, the unsettling truth became clear. Nothing about this man matched the life of an ordinary traveler. Everything about him suggested intention, and yet nothing pointed to who he really was.
The discovery of the body on Somerton Beach left investigators with more questions than answers, but they were far from finished. In an era where people traveled light and tracked their belongings carefully, one of the first things police did was check Adelaide railway station for unclaimed luggage. If the man had arrived by train, and clues in his pockets suggested he had, then his belongings might be sitting somewhere nearby. And there, in the station's cloakroom, they found it. A brown, slightly worn suitcase, checked in on November 30th, the very evening before the man was seen alive for the final time. The suitcase was unremarkable on the outside. No name tag, no address label, nothing to indicate its owner. That alone made officers suspicious. Travelers almost always labeled their luggage. Inside the cloakroom ledger, the caretaker recalled nothing unusual about the man who dropped it off. He had paid the fee, placed the case among dozens of others, and walked away. If he ever intended to return for it, he never got the chance. When police pried open the suitcase, they expected clarity. Instead, they found a collection of items so strange and contradictory that the mystery only deepened. The clothing inside, like the clothing on the man himself, had every identifying label removed with surgical precision. Shirts, trousers, ties, all neatly folded, all anonymous. A distinctive orange thread spool caught the investigators' attention. It wasn't sold anywhere in Australia at the time. That thread was later found used in repairs on the Somerton man's clothing, confirming that the suitcase almost certainly belonged to him. But the items inside were more than just clothing. They found a shaving kit, a tailored dressing gown with odd stitching, and a table knife that had been sharpened down into a crude tool. This altered knife immediately raised the eyebrows of those familiar with naval or merchant marine practices. Such modified tools were often used by sailors for cutting rope or performing small on-board tasks, suggesting the man may have had a maritime background, or at least wanted to appear as though he did. Then there were the stencils. Small, seemingly insignificant cardboard pieces with letters and symbols used for stencil work. Some investigators believed they were connected to merchant ships or military equipment labeling. Others thought they could be part of a code system or used to mark cargo secretly. No conclusion was ever reached. Each theory felt plausible until you dug deeper, and then it evaporated. The suitcase also contained a peculiar coat that had been tailored in an American style rarely seen in Australia. Had he lived abroad? Was he a traveler? A migrant? Or did the coat simply come second-hand through a trade store or market? The police traced the coat's stitching back to a US manufacturer, but no record ever connected it to a specific buyer. One of the most unnerving discoveries was what wasn't found: any official documentation. No passport, no letters, no receipts, no identifying papers of any kind. It was as though the man had curated the contents precisely to reveal nothing. In the 1940s, people carried papers everywhere. Identification was essential. The total absence of personal documents wasn't just strange, it was deliberate. Investigators catalogued every item carefully, searching for patterns. But the patterns only led to contradictions. The man had American thread repairs, an American-style coat, yet no sign he ever entered Australia through official channels. He had tools consistent with naval use, yet no service records could link him to the Navy. He had stencils used in shipping or military work, yet no employer came forward to recognize them. Even his personal hygiene items were oddly selective, some expensive, some cheap, none consistent with a single lifestyle or income level. As word leaked to the press that police had found a suitcase connected to the strange beach death, speculation grew wildly. Was the man a spy? A deserter? A smuggler? A missing traveler? Each new discovery fed another theory, but none brought the investigation closer to a truth. The suitcase felt like a puzzle, intentionally designed without a solution, a collection of mismatched clues meant to raise questions rather than answer them. By the time investigators closed the lid, the suitcase had become a symbol of the entire case.
an object that should have offered clarity, yet instead expanded the mystery into something far larger than an unexplained death on a quiet Australian beach. If the man had hoped to hide his identity, he had succeeded. Everything he carried seemed crafted to erase his past, leaving only fragments of a life that refused to be reconstructed.
When the Somerton man's body was brought from the beach to the Adelaide City morgue, the medical examiners expected the same routine they had followed countless times before. A middle-aged man found dead in a public place, with no wounds, no signs of robbery, and no visible trauma. Surely the cause of death would reveal itself quickly under the cold, sharp lights of the autopsy room. But the moment the examination began, the case ceased to be ordinary. The man appeared to be in exceptional health for his age. His organs were well developed, his muscles strong, and there were no signs of chronic illness, malnutrition, or long-term disease. His heart, lungs, and liver showed no abnormalities severe enough to kill a man. In fact, the pathologist later remarked that he seemed as healthy as someone decades younger, yet he was unquestionably dead. What puzzled doctors first were the small details, the kind that don't stand out until you realize how little else makes sense. His pupils were unusually small, a detail consistent with certain poisons. His spleen was enlarged, nearly 3 times the normal size, suggesting his body had undergone stress or shock shortly before death. His stomach contained remnants of pasty food, but nothing spoiled, nothing toxic, no alcohol, no foul smell, and no sign that he had ingested anything violently harmful. The mystery deepened when they noticed his blood vessels showed a peculiar congestion, as though his body had reacted to something rapidly, too rapidly for him to cry out or move. Poison became the quiet, looming theory. In the 1940s, many toxins commonly used by criminals or spies left distinctive residues or tissue damage. But some rare compounds, particularly certain cardiac glycosides and alkaloid-based poisons, were nearly undetectable with period technology. These substances could stop the heart with minimal inflammation, leaving almost no trace behind. The fact that the man was found in a peaceful seated position suggested he may have collapsed suddenly, without a struggle. That kind of quiet death was characteristic of swift-acting poisons, the kind that shut down vital functions before the victim fully realized what was happening. Still, when the toxicology tests came back, there was nothing. No cyanide, no digitalis, no barbiturates, nothing that could be conclusively identified. The absence of detectable poison was so baffling that one of the examining doctors told reporters that if poison was used, it had to be a poison unknown to science. It was an exaggeration, but it captured the frustration perfectly. Even the most skilled toxicologists in Adelaide could not find a single clear chemical culprit. The idea that the man had died of natural causes was briefly floated, but dismissed quickly. Healthy middle-aged men do not simply die in such a poised, almost composed posture. They do not remove all identifying marks from their clothes. They do not carry coded scraps of foreign text in their pockets. And they do not end up lying perfectly arranged on a public beach unless something far more deliberate is involved. As investigators pressed for answers, doctors revisited the possibility of rare poisons, ones difficult to detect even today. 2 in particular were whispered about: strophanthine, a plant-derived cardiac toxin used historically by African tribes on arrows, and digitalis, derived from foxglove. Both could kill swiftly, silently, leaving a body looking almost asleep. But both typically left microscopic traces that examiners, even in 1948, believed they would have found. Still, the absence of evidence didn't rule them out completely. Some researchers later theorized that a precise microdose could evade detection, especially with the limited tools available at the time. The autopsy, expected to bring clarity, instead brought a bizarre contradiction. Every organ told the story of a man in good health. Every symptom pointed toward a fast-acting poison. Every test came back inconclusive. The medical puzzle was so profound that one frustrated examiner called it the perfect poison case. Not because the poison itself was perfect, but because the mystery was. No answers, no leads, nothing definitive. Only anomalies stacked upon contradictions. In the end, the coroner wrote that he could not determine the cause of death. An astonishing conclusion for a man whose body showed signs of sudden collapse,
whose behavior before death was eerily calm, and whose clues pointed toward deliberate erasure. The Somerton man had died of something that left no fingerprints, no evidence, and no trail. And that frightening possibility, the idea of a death so clean it seemed intentional, was about to push the investigation into its strangest chapter yet.
Investigators had spent weeks chasing every lead, from the carefully packed suitcase at the Adelaide railway station to the strange, untraceable movements of the man on Somerton Beach. Yet the breakthrough came unexpectedly, not from the morgue, nor from the railway station, but inside the parked car of a local man whose connection to the Somerton man was initially unclear. In the vehicle, tucked between the seats, was a small, unassuming copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the same classic Persian poetry collection that had once fascinated countless readers with its reflections on fate, love, and mortality. On first glance, it seemed like a forgotten literary curiosity, but investigators quickly realized this was no ordinary book. The back page of the Rubaiyat had been meticulously torn out. The absence was not just a minor imperfection, it matched perfectly with the tiny scrap of paper discovered in the dead man's pocket, which bore the cryptic words, Taman Shud, meaning, "It is finished." The discovery of the book in someone else's possession raised more questions than it answered. Why would this copy of the Rubaiyat find its way into an unrelated local man's car? What significance did it hold for the dead man? And most importantly, what secrets lay hidden within its pages? As forensic experts examined the book, they noticed something extraordinary. Though the last page had been torn away, faint impressions of the original writing remained, pressed subtly into the remaining paper. Using careful lighting, magnification, and early photographic enhancement techniques available in the late 1940s, analysts revealed a sequence of letters arranged in a deliberate pattern. At first, they appeared as random characters, a chaotic jumble with no discernible order. Yet seasoned cryptographers and intelligence officers immediately recognized signs of intentionality. The letters were too structured to be mere doodles. Someone had purposefully left behind a message. Scholars, code breakers, and naval intelligence officers pored over the sequence. Some theorized it could be a simple cipher, a substitution code where each letter represented another, a technique commonly used in espionage circles during the post-war period. Others suggested more complex possibilities, such as an acrostic derived from the Rubaiyat's poetry, or even a one-time pad, a system nearly impossible to crack without the original key. Every attempt to decode it produced tantalizing fragments of patterns, hints of words that seemed to form phrases, only to collapse under further scrutiny. The code became a riddle within a riddle, a message that might reveal identity, motives, or a final confession, but which refused to yield its secrets. Adding to the enigma, the book itself hinted at a personal connection. Faint pencil markings, subtle underlinings of certain quatrains, and smudged fingerprints suggested that the dead man, or someone intimately connected to him, had handled it with care. The very choice of the Rubaiyat, a text long associated with reflection on life, death, and the ephemeral nature of existence, seemed deliberate. Was it a personal farewell, a literary signature, or a cryptic message intended for someone else? Investigators struggled with the implications. Every new clue deepened the mystery rather than clarifying it. The discovery of the book and its hidden code would become one of the defining features of the Taman Shud case. It bridged seemingly disconnected threads, the mysterious death, the torn scrap of paper, and the possibility of a hidden life or secret mission. Despite decades of effort, the code remains largely unsolved. Experts still debate whether it is an intelligent cipher, a personal mnemonic, or simply a sequence of meaningless letters. The Rubaiyat had revealed more than a cryptic code. Faintly scrawled along its inner margin was a telephone number. It was barely legible, as if someone had written it in a hurry or in fear of being seen. Investigators traced the number to a local nurse, known publicly only as Jestin. Unlike most of the leads in the Somerton man case, Jestin was a living link to the puzzle, a person who had interacted with the mysterious book before or after the man's death. Her involvement would become one of the most scrutinized elements of the case, a point of fascination for amateur sleuths, conspiracy theorists, and professional investigators alike. When police first approached her,
Justin's reaction was notable. Witnesses and officers alike recalled the subtle but unmistakable startle, a flicker of fear, a hesitation in speech, and a sudden flush of color on her otherwise composed face. She maintained that she had no knowledge of the man found on Somerton Beach, yet her connection to the book could not be ignored. In the tense post-war climate of 1948 Adelaide, any unusual or unexplained link could be interpreted in multiple ways. Some speculated that she had known the man personally. Others proposed more sinister possibilities, that she was involved in espionage, or that the man had been trying to reach her for reasons that were never clarified. Justin lived an otherwise ordinary life. She was respected in the community, a trained nurse with no criminal record and no overt ties to intelligence networks. But in the investigation, every mundane detail of her routine became magnified. Her name, written as if in code or secrecy inside the Rubaiyat, raised questions that were impossible to ignore. Why would the Somerton man, or whomever placed the book in the car, include her phone number? Was it a plea for help, a warning, or part of some elaborate personal correspondence? Even decades later, researchers remain divided on whether Justin's inclusion in the case was circumstantial or intentional. Police interviewed her repeatedly, attempting to reconstruct her interactions and movements in the days surrounding the discovery of the body. Justin claimed she had never met the man, and that the phone number written in the book was intended for a friend or acquaintance, though she refused to elaborate further. Some skeptics argued that her nervousness during the initial questioning implied she knew more than she revealed, while others suggested her reaction was simply human, shock at being unexpectedly pulled into one of Australia's most confounding mysteries. Regardless of her intentions, the appearance of her number in the book provided investigators with a tantalizing lead, a living contact connected to the dead man, and perhaps a key to understanding his final movements. The mystery deepened when subtle details emerged about her interactions with the man. Though she publicly denied knowing him, Justin's demeanor during interviews suggested an instinctive caution, a reluctance to draw unnecessary attention. Letters, phone records, and sparse personal notes hinted at possible correspondence or social connections, but no definitive link was ever established. Historians and case enthusiasts have since debated whether Justin was unwittingly dragged into a web of espionage, or if her presence was nothing more than coincidence amplified by the surrounding mystery. Justin's story illustrates the human side of the Taman Shud case. Unlike the anonymous man on the beach, she was alive, aware, and part of a social world that intersected briefly with one of history's most baffling unsolved deaths. Her reactions, visible, human, and complicated, invite endless speculation, and yet the truth remains frustratingly out of reach. Was she a witness, a confidant, or simply an ordinary nurse caught in extraordinary circumstances? The answer, like so many in this case, remains elusive.
Justin had always been a figure of quiet intrigue in the Taman Shud case, but the mystery deepened when investigators began looking at her young son. In photographs and later witness accounts, the boy exhibited unusual features, distinctive enough that medical experts and genealogists took notice. Among the most striking was pronounced hypodontia, a congenital condition in which certain teeth are congenitally missing. In addition, the boy's ears displayed an uncommon shape, with a slight fold and ridge pattern rarely seen in the general population. These characteristics were not merely quirks. They were identifiable markers that, when combined, suggested a possible genetic connection to another individual. Speculation immediately turned to the Somerton man. Those who examined the surviving photographs of his face noted the same rare dental traits and similarly shaped ears. It was a detail that, if true, could point to a direct biological link. Could Justin's son actually be the child of the mysterious man whose identity had eluded investigators for decades? If so, what story had been hidden behind the silence of a nurse, a mother, and a dead stranger on a beach? Every detail seemed to suggest a personal narrative that had been obscured deliberately, leaving only fragments for historians and investigators to piece together. Despite the tantalizing physical similarities, proving a biological connection proved nearly impossible at the time. In 1948, forensic genetics was in its infancy. Blood typing offered only broad categories and could not establish parentage with certainty. Investigators noted the resemblances, compared them against photographic evidence,
and recorded them meticulously, but no test could definitively link the boy to the Somerton man. As a result, the theory remained a whisper in police files, an intriguing possibility that could neither be confirmed nor dismissed. Adding to the tension was Justin's own demeanor. She remained steadfast in her public statements, denying any connection to the dead man. Yet subtle behaviors, her protective instincts toward her child, her insistence on privacy, and her careful avoidance of certain questions, led some researchers to speculate that she had knowledge of a relationship or encounter that was never fully disclosed. Was it a brief liaison, a tragic romance, or something even more complex? The case offers no clear answers, only the shadows of what might have been. The story of Justin's son also highlights a broader point about the Taman Shud mystery. Identity is not always straightforward. Even when physical evidence seems compelling, human lives are layered with secrecy, shame, and circumstance. Many of the features that intrigued investigators could have been coincidental or explained by extended family genetics. But in a case defined by absence, no ID, no known family, no clear motive, even the smallest similarity was magnified into potential significance. Every facial angle, dental gap, and ear ridge became a clue, a symbol of the tantalizing gap between what is visible and what remains hidden. Historians, genealogists, and forensic specialists have returned to this thread repeatedly over the decades, using increasingly advanced techniques. In recent years, DNA testing has brought new possibilities, offering a chance to compare genetic material across generations. Even so, privacy concerns, the decay of available samples, and uncertain chain of custody issues have prevented any definitive proof. The connection between Justin's son and the Somerton man continues to occupy a liminal space. Part hypothesis, part legend, and part haunting what if. It underscores the human dimension of the case, that behind cryptic codes, mysterious deaths, and abandoned books, there may have been ordinary lives entangled in extraordinary circumstances, their secrets locked in genetic whispers that remain just out of reach.
For decades, much of the fascination with the Somerton man has revolved around espionage theories, Cold War intrigue, and cryptic codes. Yet, beyond the smoke and mirrors of spy speculation lies a more ordinary, human dimension, one that is often overlooked in sensational retellings of the case. The Somerton man may have been, in fact, an unremarkable individual caught in circumstances that were anything but ordinary. Exploring these possibilities does not diminish the mystery. It grounds it in a reality that was, for the time, all too plausible. Consider the life of a travelling worker. Post-war Australia was a land of movement, with men drifting between towns in search of employment, work that often required anonymity and adaptability. Jobs in shipping, railway construction, or labour-intensive factories drew individuals far from their families, and many kept minimal personal possessions to facilitate mobility. The Somerton man's meticulous clothing, polished shoes, and carefully packed suitcase could reflect a man accustomed to travel, someone who valued appearances not for vanity but for necessity. The lack of identification might not indicate espionage, but rather a practical choice by someone who lived transiently and avoided unnecessary bureaucracy. Another plausible scenario is that of a depressed romantic or heartbroken individual. Many suicide cases from the mid-20th century remain shrouded in mystery precisely because there was no note, no confession, and no public acknowledgement of private despair. The Somerton man's choice of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book steeped in reflections on life, death, and existential finality, may have been personal rather than cryptic. The torn Taman Shud scrap could symbolize the end of a chapter in life, a poetic farewell rather than a coded message. In this light, his meticulous appearance could represent a final act of dignity, preserving a semblance of control in a life that felt increasingly uncontrollable. Migration patterns also offer a compelling context. The post-war period saw an influx of immigrants into Australia, many of whom had lost connections to family, language, and social networks. A man arriving from overseas with no local ties could easily vanish into anonymity, leaving behind no trace of friends, relatives, or social affiliations. In such cases, death, even under seemingly mysterious circumstances, might generate fascination not because it was extraordinary, but precisely because it was ordinary, leaving little evidence behind.
Historical patterns show that many unidentified bodies belong to travelers, migrants, or socially isolated individuals. Yet these mundane explanations are often overshadowed by sensational theories. Even the subtle details of the Somerton man's possessions support ordinary explanations. His clothing, though immaculate, was typical of a working man of the era. His suitcase contained tools and items that could serve multiple practical purposes, not necessarily instruments of espionage. Investigators focused on anomalies, the missing hat, the absent labels, the unusual codes. But what appeared unusual could also be contextual. A man navigating a world of social upheaval, post-war instability, and personal hardship might leave behind traces that seem enigmatic only when removed from the ordinary circumstances of his life. Ultimately, examining the Somerton man as an ordinary individual reminds us of the human dimension behind the mystery. He may have been a worker, a migrant, or someone quietly suffering emotional turmoil. The absence of concrete identity, family, or personal narrative amplifies the sense of enigma, but it is a reminder that not all mysteries require espionage or conspiracy. Sometimes, the intersection of ordinary human struggles with chance circumstances is enough to create enduring intrigue. The allure of a spy story, after all, may obscure the simplest truth, that the Somerton man, however unusual his death, may have lived a life no more extraordinary than countless others whose stories are quietly forgotten. While mundane explanations for the Somerton man remain plausible, the historical context of post-war Australia makes espionage a compelling avenue for consideration. In 1948, the nation was not an isolated backwater, but a front line in the early stages of the Cold War. International intelligence networks were active, and Australia's southern coast, particularly Adelaide, became an unlikely but strategically significant hub. Just hundreds of kilometers from the city lay the Woomera Test Range, a sprawling desert facility used for missile trials and experimental research, including work linked to atomic energy and weapons technology. The presence of this highly sensitive installation made the region a natural focus for foreign intelligence operatives. During this period, multiple spy rings were known to operate across Australia. Soviet operatives, often disguised as ordinary citizens or migrant workers, sought to infiltrate scientific research, defense projects, and political institutions. British intelligence had already raised alarms over Soviet surveillance networks, and local authorities were under pressure to monitor suspicious activity. It is in this charged environment that the Somerton man's possessions and behaviors draw particular attention. While on the surface, a well-dressed man with a small suitcase might seem ordinary, certain features raise eyebrow after eyebrow among experts. His suitcase contained tools and stencils with naval associations, items that could easily belong to a technician or worker, but could also serve as discrete equipment for signal encoding, document preparation, or covert operations. The meticulous arrangement of his clothing, absence of labels, and even the lack of a hat, remarkable in a society where men wore hats almost by default, could indicate someone trained to avoid traceable identifiers. Moreover, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, often interpreted as a personal memento, could also serve as an innocuous carrier of coded messages, hiding communications in plain sight. Investigators also noted behavioral clues consistent with espionage tradecraft. The Somerton man's apparent ability to travel without identification, his discreet presence in public spaces, and his careful handling of possessions are traits frequently emphasized in training manuals for intelligence operatives. Such behaviors, when contextualized against the backdrop of Adelaide's proximity to Woomera, suggest a scenario in which a foreign agent could feasibly operate under the radar. Whether his mission involved monitoring military trials, observing nuclear research, or engaging in more mundane intelligence gathering, the Somerton man's lifestyle aligns curiously well with known patterns of clandestine activity. Yet even as espionage theory seems plausible, it remains speculative. No conclusive evidence links him to foreign intelligence, and much of the supporting details, tools, clothing, a mysterious book, could just as easily belong to a solitary, itinerant man with no spy connections. What makes the espionage hypothesis compelling is the intersection of historical probability with circumstantial evidence. The timing, the region, and the nature of his possessions all fit the profile of a Cold War operative, even if proof remains elusive. This tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary defines much of the Taman Shud case. On one hand, the Somerton man could have been a migrant, a traveling worker, or a man dealing with personal crises. On the other, he may have been a highly trained operative, leaving behind subtle signs of a life lived in shadows. Analysts, historians, and cryptographers continue to weigh these possibilities, passing every detail from the torn scrap of paper to the faintly impressed letters in the Rubaiyat, searching for definitive proof that might explain why a man with no identity ended up dead on a quiet beach. In this light, espionage is not a fanciful theory, but a plausible interpretation shaped by the historical, political, and technological realities of the time. The faintly impressed letters on the torn page of the Rubaiyat became one of the most studied and debated elements of the Taman Shud case. At first glance, the sequences appeared to be a random jumble, almost a meaningless scrawl left behind by a distracted hand. Yet experts in naval intelligence, cryptography, and code-breaking approached the letters with meticulous care, scanning for patterns, repetitions, and clues that might reveal a hidden message. Over the decades, no single explanation has achieved universal agreement, leaving the code as much a puzzle as the identity of the Somerton man himself. One of the most popular interpretations is that the letters form an acrostic, a subtle cipher woven into a literary framework. Supporters of this theory argue that each letter could correspond to the first letters of words in a poem, possibly drawn from the Rubaiyat itself or from an entirely separate source. This would allow a personal message to be encoded within the context of an ordinary-looking book, a method that would be both elegant and clandestine. Yet skeptics counter that the sequences are too irregular, lacking the structural consistency that would make an acrostic reliable. The repetition of certain letters and the apparent absence of any coherent sentence structure make this theory compelling to some, but unconvincing to others. Another hypothesis suggests a mnemonic system. In this scenario, the letters were not a conventional code, but a memory aid, a personal shorthand known only to the writer. It could have been a sequence representing names, places, or instructions meant to be decoded mentally, not by any outsider. While this idea accounts for the apparent randomness of the letters, it raises further questions. Why would such a personal mnemonic be left behind in a book that eventually found its way into a car, unrelated to the dead man? If intended solely for private memory, why tear the page out and leave only the scrap with Taman Shud? The mnemonic theory is tantalizing for its simplicity, but frustrating in its unprovable nature. Some analysts have speculated that the code could be a one-time pad cipher, a method widely used in espionage that generates completely random key sequences to encrypt messages. If this were the case, cracking the letters without the original key would be essentially impossible. Proponents of the espionage hypothesis point to this possibility as evidence that the Somerton man may have been involved in intelligence work. Yet the one-time pad theory is similarly unprovable. No corresponding key has ever been found, and there is no direct evidence tying the man to formal spy training. Still, the theory persists because it aligns with the historical context of Cold War Australia and the proximity of sensitive military installations. Finally, there is the simplest, but often overlooked, possibility that the letters are random markings with no intended meaning. Humans are naturally inclined to detect patterns, even in chaos. It is entirely plausible that the Somerton man, or someone else who handled the book, created the sequence absent-mindedly, or as a private doodle, with no purpose beyond personal amusement or distraction. This theory is often dismissed because it seems too mundane, yet in a case where almost every detail has been overinterpreted, it cannot be ruled out. The enduring frustration is that each theory has compelling arguments and equally persuasive rebuttals. Naval intelligence officers could see the potential for espionage, cryptographers could detect structure, and literary scholars could imagine hidden poetic messages. Yet none could definitively prove that any interpretation was correct. The code exists in a liminal space between intention and accident, secrecy and coincidence. It is at once the most promising and the most confounding clue in a case already defined by ambiguity. The letters on that page, faint, imprinted, and unresolved, continue to draw theorists, cryptographers, and curious minds into decades of debate. Whether an elaborate spy cipher, a personal mnemonic, or meaningless scratches on paper, the code embodies the essence of the Taman Shud mystery. A tantalizing enigma that invites endless speculation. One of the most perplexing aspects of the Taman Shud case is the manner of the Somerton man's death. Autopsy reports showed no obvious trauma, no disease, no signs of conventional poisoning detectable with the forensic methods of the time. Yet the circumstances, his rigid posture on the beach, the placid expression on his face, and the absence of any clear cause of death, hinted at something far more sinister. This led forensic experts to consider rare toxins, substances capable of killing quickly while leaving little or no trace. In 1948, the field of toxicology was limited in scope, especially in detecting exotic or plant-based poisons. Cardiac glycosides, such as digitalis or uabane, were known to be highly potent. These substances affect the heart, sometimes leading to sudden cardiac arrest. Under certain conditions, they could be administered in amounts sufficient to cause death, yet leave minimal residual evidence detectable by standard autopsy procedures. Alkaloids derived from plants, like strychnine or certain rare nightshades, also presented challenges for detection. Highly toxic, they could produce rapid symptoms that mimicked natural cardiac failure or sudden illness. The precision required to use these toxins effectively cannot be overstated. Administering a fatal dose without overt symptoms beforehand demands knowledge of physiology, careful preparation, and timing. Historians and forensic scientists have argued that the successful application of such poisons in 1948 would have been within the capabilities of only a highly trained individual. This fact has been a cornerstone in support of the espionage theory. A man with intelligence training could acquire, handle, and administer such substances with deadly efficiency, leaving virtually no evidence behind. Yet, this explanation raises additional questions. How did the Somerton man obtain these toxins? Some, like digitalis, were prescribed for medical purposes and could be sourced through pharmacies, but others, exotic alkaloids, would have required specialized knowledge or connections. Could he have been an amateur experimenting with plants or compounds he found in local gardens or imported goods? Or was it more likely that he had access to a network that could provide substances designed to evade contemporary detection methods? The lack of concrete evidence makes each scenario speculative, but it highlights the extraordinary challenge faced by investigators in 1948. Another element fueling debate is the manner of administration. There were no injection marks, no wounds, no obvious ingestion devices. This implies that if a poison was involved, it may have been applied through subtler methods, mixed into a drink, concealed in food, or absorbed through the skin. Historical records and toxicology literature from the period note that certain cardiac glycosides can be fatal even in tiny, seemingly innocuous doses, particularly if delivered in a concentrated form. Such methods demand both anatomical knowledge and a careful understanding of timing, reinforcing the idea that the Somerton man's death, if poisoned, was anything but accidental. Despite the theoretical plausibility, no toxicological evidence was ever recovered. The Somerton man's tissues were later re-examined with modern techniques during exhumation decades later, but results were inconclusive, partly due to degradation and the rarity of substances that might have been used. This enduring uncertainty allows the perfect poison theory to persist, the notion that only a person with exceptional skill could administer a substance so lethal, so undetectable, and so precisely timed that even expert pathologists could find no trace. In the absence of confirmation, this remains one of the most tantalizing threads connecting the Somerton man to the broader espionage context, reinforcing the intersection of human mystery, science, and historical intrigue.
Decades after the Somerton man's mysterious death, modern science offered a new hope for answers: DNA analysis. In 2021, Australian authorities exhumed the body nearly 73 years after it was first found on Somerton Beach. The goal was clear but daunting: to extract viable genetic material that could finally reveal the identity of the man who had eluded investigators for generations. With advances in forensic genetics, genealogical DNA analysis, and bioinformatics, experts hoped to piece together a biological portrait of a man whose life had left behind almost no trace. Early results were both promising and frustrating. Genetic sequencing confirmed that the Somerton man likely had European ancestry,
consistent with hypotheses drawn from his physical features. Certain haplogroups suggested familial links that could, in theory, be traced across continents, offering the possibility of identifying distant relatives. This opened a door for investigative genealogists to explore family trees, migration patterns, and historical records, searching for matches that could finally place the mysterious man within a known lineage. The use of modern genetic genealogy, comparing DNA sequences against large databases of living individuals, represented an unprecedented tool in the decades-long investigation. Yet the limitations were equally significant. After more than 7 decades in a burial environment, the Somerton man's remains had undergone natural degradation, leaving DNA fragmented and incomplete. Despite the use of advanced extraction methods, large portions of the genome remained inaccessible, preventing a full reconstruction. This meant that, while some leads could be generated, certainty was still out of reach. Partial matches to distant relatives offered tantalizing possibilities, but they could not definitively identify the man. Each result brought both hope and frustration, as genealogists navigated the line between statistical probability and conclusive evidence. The exhumation also allowed forensic anthropologists to revisit physical assessments with modern technology. High-resolution imaging, facial reconstruction software, and skeletal analysis provided a more nuanced understanding of the Somerton man's age, stature, and possible health conditions. Combined with DNA insights, these techniques have created a richer, multidimensional profile than was possible in 1948. Still, the questions that defined the case, who he was, why he was in Adelaide, and what led to his death, remain unanswered, illustrating the limits of science in the face of a story shaped by secrecy, lost records, and the passage of time. Despite these challenges, the exhumation and genetic testing have invigorated public and academic interest. They have demonstrated the potential of modern forensics to revisit cold cases once thought unsolvable, and they underscore the evolving relationship between historical investigation and science. The case of the Somerton man stands at the intersection of history, mystery, and technology, showing how new methods can shed light on old enigmas, even when the light is partial or diffuse. Ultimately, the 2021 exhumation highlights both the possibilities and the constraints of modern science. DNA analysis can suggest ancestry, hint at familial connections, and provide a genetic fingerprint for comparison. But it cannot, in isolation, reconstruct memory, motive, or circumstance. The Somerton man's story, written in the faint ink of a torn book, the silent letters of an unresolved code, and the traces of his body in a grave by the sea, remains largely intact, even as we gain new insights into his biological identity. In this way, the case exemplifies a central tension in forensic history. Science can illuminate, it can clarify, and it can guide, but some mysteries persist as human choices, lost documents, and unexplained deaths defy complete resolution. The Taman Shud case has not only inspired serious investigations, but also a host of fringe theories that, while intriguing, often veer toward the bizarre. These ideas thrive in the absence of definitive evidence, filling the vacuum left by decades of unanswered questions. Each theory attempts to explain the Somerton man's mysterious death, yet under scrutiny, most collapse under the weight of logic, circumstance, or historical context. Nonetheless, examining them provides insight into why this case has fascinated the public for generations. One of the more unusual hypotheses is that of suicide by symbolic ritual. Proponents argue that the Somerton man's death, combined with the torn scrap of paper reading Taman Shud, reflects a carefully staged farewell. The use of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a text concerned with the ephemeral nature of life, could indicate a deliberate, almost ceremonial, approach to death. In this view, the positioning of the body, the absence of personal identification, and even the meticulous attire are interpreted as symbolic gestures, a coded narrative of despair and finality. Critics, however, point out that this theory relies heavily on subjective interpretation. While poetic and evocative, it cannot account for the physical mysteries, such as the possibility of rare toxins or the coded letters in the book. Another fringe idea is that the Somerton man was a fugitive, escaping a complex or criminal past. This theory suggests he may have been running from legal authorities, family entanglements, or unresolved debts, adopting a new identity and disappearing intentionally. Certain elements seem to support this: the absence of identification, the careful removal of clothing labels, and the man's ability to navigate public spaces discreetly. Yet investigators have found no record of missing persons, criminal warrants, or other evidence linking him to a fugitive lifestyle. While tantalizing, this explanation lacks verifiable support and cannot explain the persistent anomalies surrounding his death. A related concept is deliberate identity erasure. Perhaps the Somerton man was a man who meticulously scrubbed his existence from official records, creating a life so anonymized that even death could not betray him. Proponents point to the removal of clothing labels, the absence of personal papers, and the use of a seemingly innocuous book to carry cryptic messages. While intriguing, this theory assumes extraordinary foresight and skill, requiring decades of planning to erase all traces of one's existence. Such a level of premeditation seems improbable for a man who ultimately met his end in a seemingly random location on a public beach. Some of the most speculative theories involve mistaken identity. Could the Somerton man have been confused with another missing person? Certain accounts have compared his features to missing individuals, suggesting a tragic overlap of coincidences. However, physical records, photographs, and dental assessments from the period provide no convincing matches. This theory, though sensational, relies on conjecture rather than verifiable evidence, and its proponents have largely been sidelined by researchers seeking more substantial explanations. Despite their implausibility, these fringe theories endure because the Taman Shud case is defined by gaps and contradictions. Each unexplained element, an unidentified body, a torn scrap of Persian text, a faintly coded book, and mysterious genetic hints, invites imaginative leaps. Human psychology naturally seeks narrative closure, and in the absence of certainty, speculation thrives. Yet careful examination reveals that most of these ideas cannot withstand scrutiny. They are fascinating stories, but they do not provide testable hypotheses or verifiable evidence. Ultimately, the appeal of these fringe explanations lies not in their likelihood, but in their capacity to engage the imagination. They highlight the cultural and psychological dimensions of the mystery, demonstrating how a lack of answers can give rise to elaborate narratives. The Taman Shud case, therefore, is as much a story about human curiosity and the need for closure as it is about a man who vanished under extraordinary circumstances. Even in their implausibility, these theories underscore the enduring fascination with a case that resists explanation. Amid the swirling theories of espionage, coded messages, and exotic poisons, one hypothesis about the Somerton man often goes overlooked: that he was, at heart, an ordinary man living an extraordinary secret. Far from spies, conspiracies, or international intrigue, he may have simply led a double life, one hidden from the world, but shaped by personal struggles, failed relationships, and private misadventures. This grounded perspective does not rely on coded messages or untraceable toxins. Instead, it examines the human side of a mystery that has fascinated the world for decades. Consider the evidence through this lens. The meticulous attention to his clothing, the careful removal of identifying labels, and the cryptic note in his pocket could all point to a man attempting to conceal personal details. Perhaps he feared judgment, exposure, or emotional entanglement. The presence of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a book reflecting on the fleeting nature of life, could have held personal significance, a silent reflection on his inner turmoil rather than a tool for espionage. The torn scrap reading, "Taman Shud, it is finished," may not have been a message for the world, but a quiet farewell to a chapter of his own life that had become unbearable. If the Somerton man's death was the result of misadventure or intentional poisoning following a personal crisis, it illustrates how ordinary tragedies can leave extraordinarily mysterious footprints. The careful preparation, the absence of identification, and the seemingly deliberate concealment of his existence could have been his way of controlling the narrative of his own demise. In a society post-World War II, where men were expected to project stoicism and composure, such acts of quiet desperation may have gone unnoticed or misunderstood by those around him. This theory also helps explain the ordinary plausibility behind the enigmatic elements of the case. The so-called code in the Rubaiyat may have been a personal mnemonic or a private cipher meant only to make sense to him, not to communicate with the outside world. The absence of obvious poison traces could result from substances known to those with basic pharmacological knowledge, or even from accidental ingestion of natural compounds in his environment. Every detail, under this lens, becomes a clue, not to grand conspiracies, but to the intimate struggles of a single human being. Importantly, this theory acknowledges the emotional dimension of the case. Many overlooked mysteries in history, unidentified bodies, disappearances, or unusual deaths, are the result of human vulnerability, heartbreak, and flawed judgment, rather than international intrigue. Viewing the Somerton man as a person grappling with private crises situates the case within a broader social and psychological context. It reminds us that even the most confounding mysteries may have mundane, human explanations. A man overwhelmed by circumstances, choosing secrecy in life and in death. Ultimately, the ordinary man hypothesis does not provide dramatic plot lines or cloak and dagger intrigue, but it offers a profoundly human lens through which to view the Taman Shud case. It suggests that beneath the layers of speculation and sensationalism lies a story of vulnerability, personal choice, and quiet tragedy. It reminds us that not all mysteries are born of espionage or exotic methods. Some are simply the result of life's unpredictability, leaving traces that history and curiosity can only partially reconstruct. In this light, the Somerton man becomes more than a puzzle or a cipher. He is a reflection of the human condition, a reminder that even ordinary lives, when shrouded in secrecy and shadowed by personal crises, can leave behind legacies that captivate and confound the world for generations. Sometimes, the strangest footprints are left not by the extraordinary, but by those navigating the ordinary in extraordinary circumstances.
The Taman Shud case endures not because of a single clue or a dramatic revelation, but because it exists at the intersection of mystery, history, and human imagination. For over 7 decades, the Somerton man has remained anonymous, his identity erased from every record, his motives a matter of speculation, and his story fragmented by contradictions and unanswered questions. Each detail, from the torn scrap of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam to the faintly coded letters and the mysterious phone number, serves as a tantalizing hint, offering glimpses of a life that vanished before it could be fully understood. One of the most compelling aspects of the case is the way it straddles genres. On one hand, there is the palpable sense of tragedy. A man found lifeless on a quiet Australian beach, alone, unknown, and unclaimed. His death evokes empathy, prompting us to imagine the circumstances that led to this final, silent moment. On the other hand, the case reads like an espionage thriller. Cryptic notes, rare toxins, codes that defy decryption, and the ever-present spectre of Cold War intrigue. It is this duality, the tension between human vulnerability and shadowy sophistication, that continues to captivate researchers, enthusiasts, and casual observers alike. The contradictions inherent in the evidence deepen the allure. Every discovery seems to answer one question while creating several more. The suitcase at Adelaide railway station hints at preparation, yet provides no concrete identity. The faint code in the book could be a cipher, a mnemonic, or meaningless scribbles. DNA analysis suggests European ancestry but fails to pinpoint familial connections. Even the seemingly simple fact of his impeccable clothing or carefully concealed identity invites endless interpretation. This constant oscillation between clarity and ambiguity creates a narrative that is both confounding and irresistible. Culturally, the Taman Shud case has become emblematic of unsolved mysteries that resist the passage of time. It is cited in studies of cryptography, forensic science, and historical investigation. It is debated on podcasts, explored in documentaries, and dissected in online forums. The story appeals not just to those seeking closure, but to those fascinated by uncertainty itself, the human attraction to puzzles that cannot be fully solved, to questions that linger at the edges of knowledge. In this sense, the Somerton man is more than a person. He is a symbol of mystery, a blank canvas onto which generations project theories, fears, and curiosity.
The enduring fascination also stems from the personal and the relatable. Despite the intrigue of espionage or exotic toxins, at its core, the story is about a single human life, interrupted in a way that left almost no trace. Whether he was an ordinary man with a secret, a grieving soul leaving a coded farewell, or a figure entwined in international intrigue, his story resonates because it is deeply human. We are drawn to his anonymity because it reflects our own questions about identity, mortality, and the narratives we leave behind. Ultimately, the Taman Shud case endures because it refuses closure. It challenges conventional investigative methods, blurs the lines between ordinary and extraordinary, and reminds us that not every story fits neatly into a tidy explanation. It invites each new generation to ask questions, analyze evidence, and explore the limits of human understanding. In doing so, it becomes not just a historical curiosity, but a living mystery that continues to inspire fascination, debate, and wonder. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here. If you enjoyed diving into this legendary mystery, check out my other channel, Lazy Chill Zone, for modern crime mysteries. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this deep dive with the history fans in your life. Whether you're captivated by unsolved crimes, cryptic codes, or the shadowy corners of post-war history, the story of the Somerton Man is one you'll carry with you long after the video ends.